Here we go. When I first saw him standing out there on the sidewalk, I thought nothing of it. I certainly didn't think he'd still be out there come September. I lingered at the window for a moment, decided that the nightbound silhouette across the street was just some guy out for a walk, and went to my room to hit the hay. As I stood there, over the coffee maker next morning, my eyes strayed up to the window over the sink, and a little shock of adrenaline removed the need for caffeine. He was still there, and still standing on the opposite sidewalk, looking at my house. My roommates had all gone to work long ago, so I wanted and waited for my coffee, got dressed, then approached the front door and peered through the peephole. He was still there. I took a deep breath, readied myself for whatever nonsense was going to be entailed, and opened the door. His gaze shifted to me as soon as I stepped out onto the porch, and he watched me as I walked across the grass. He tensed when I stepped onto my sidewalk, but then I looked relieved when I crossed it and reached the curb. Stopping there, I kept the pavement between us. I didn't know exactly how to ask him what the hell he was doing. Hey, what's up? He looked a little bit nervous. Nothing, just hanging out. From where I was standing, he didn't appear to be homeless or crazy. He was a man about 40, dressed in a dark blue robe, and I vaguely recognized him. Don't you live in that house? I pointed up the driveway behind him. He nodded. Yep, that's mine. Just came out to get the newspaper. I glanced down at his hand where he held an orange bag with the newspaper rolled up inside it. Well, looks like you got it. I paused. Another orange bag was lying further up the driveway, as if the one he was holding was actually yesterday's. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with a masked, nervous expression. Did I see you out here last night too? I asked. Yep, that was me. I looked down further and I saw that his feet were bare. You weren't out here all night, were you? I expected him to laugh off the idea, but instead he replied, I was. You've been out here all night in bare feet? Panic was oozing out from under his mask of calm politeness in a dozen different ways. Yes. Now I was starting to feel more than a little weird. Are you going to stand here all day too? He strained to speak, but then it seemed to change his reply. I might. It's wonderful weather out. Well, that much was true. It was a warm summer day, bright and beautiful. Well, could you at least not stare at my house then? He began to give an apologetic shrug, but stopped halfway through the motion and tried to turn. His bare feet never lifted from the sidewalk. The attempt to turn was more of a twist from the thighs up. That too stopped rather quickly, and then he said, His gaze moved in a circle before he finally looked directly at me. Your house is nice. I like looking at it. By then, I was getting rather annoyed. What's your name? Russ. Russ, nice to meet you. I shook my head. I never had to do this before. If you don't stop being weird and staring at our house, I'm going to call the police. His eyes lit up. Yes, please do that. That was a weird enough reaction that I actually got out my phone. I'd been raised to never involve the police for any reason, but if this was abnormal enough that I felt I had to, I told the dispatcher we had a strange man standing outside our house, and that he'd been there literally all night. Yes, all night. She said 2 officers would be there shortly. Russ and I didn't talk much while we were waiting for them. He just stood there, looking at me. Random times around the neighborhood, and otherwise, ours was a quiet street populated by nice people who kept mostly to themselves. We'd never even had cause to really meet each other. If we had, I might have known more about Russ. But as things were, he was just some man acting strangely, although his aura of masked nervousness calmed as a squad car turned down the lane and approached us. 2 uniformed officers climbed out and approached us with tired stances. One asked dismissively, "What seems to be the issue, gentlemen?" Russ looked to me hopefully. I told them, "This guy's been standing out here, staring at our house all night long." The second cop rolled his eyes, but he didn't ask Russ. He did ask Russ. "That true, sir?" Russ gulped and started. "Yes." Both cops straightened at the unexpected answer. The first one asked, "Seriously?" Russ nodded. The second cop looked at each of us for a moment and then said, "Well, move it along then." Russ tensed and stood a little taller. "No." "What?" I said no. As the pair began walking towards him, he added, "Sir." As one got out handcuffs, the other sneered and said, "Listen, asshole." But he stopped about 2 feet from Russ. His partner froze as well. "Come on," Russ urged them. "What are you waiting for? Come on." The 2 men looked at each other with haunted expressions. They began to back away. The handcuffs were returned to their belt. "No!" Russ shouted at them. "Do it, you pricks, you pigs, you ugly bastards. Come on, beat me up, teach me a lesson, knock me down." The first cop's face was pale. "You're fine, sir. You're absolutely right. We're pigs. Just do what you like, stand there as long as you want. You're on your property, technically, so this is none of our business." The second one glanced at me with an apologetic terror. Both jumped in the car and peeled away. Russ screamed incoherently after them, but did not move from his spot on the sidewalk. I called the station a second time to ask what had happened, but after taking my address, the dispatcher told me never to call again and hung up. The anger faded out of Russ as he saw me lower the phone. I stood there awkwardly as the grown man across the street began to outright cry. I never seen a 40-year-old man blubber from sheer hopeless terror. "Russ, what's going on?" He couldn't answer past his tears, looking left and right first. I finally stepped into the street and got near him. I had the strangest notion, but I couldn't articulate it. The words simply would not come to mind. An instinctual awareness was the most I could manage. I did reach the opposite curb right in front of him, and I was intent on pushing him back off his spot on the sidewalk, but I changed my mind about 2 feet away from him. It would have been weird to touch a crying grown man. I stepped back into the street, confused. I tried a second time at 2 feet away from him, literally within arm's reach. I changed my mind again. He could do what he liked. Who was I to interfere if he wanted to stand outside on a beautiful day? Each time I got close, then I changed my mind. His tears and terror deepened. I remember murmuring, "All right, screw this," and I backed up into the middle of the street to get space for a running start. I couldn't articulate what I was doing, but I guessed that leaping a tackle might work. I braced myself and then launched forward, ready to spring up at a proper distance. But as I went to jump at him, I changed my mind. There was nothing wrong. I was being silly. Who cared about any of this? I slowed and curved away. His sobbing became a river, Despite an overwhelming sense that something was very wrong, I turned and slowly went back inside. I could still see him through the kitchen window, and I began going about the business of my day with a muted horror that I could not acknowledge gnawing at my heart. Each time I looked, I would hope against hope that he had moved, but he was always still there, shaking, crying, and looking around for help. That was in June. A pall hung over our neighborhood, where once my roommates and I held board game parties and had dozens of people over. Now we ate meager meals in silence. Whenever one of us would think to talk about something that had happened at work, or perhaps an event we were looking forward to, we would get half the sentence out and then be overwhelmed by a sense of hollowness. Who could care about a concert or a trip to the water park at a time like this? We would stop our sentence midway through a glance out the kitchen window as a group. Always Russ was still standing there. He successfully avoided dangerous sunburns by lifting his robe above his head during the brightest hours, and he had a few nearby trees to shade him at other times. His bare feet took the worst of it. They were red and boiled after only a week. During the second week, we gathered daily as a neighborhood. It was impossible not to have noticed him standing out there by then. And all the various residents of our street wandered out to speak to him and to one another about the various polite topics with strained undertones. Terrible weather, a neighbor would say, her eyes fearful. The weather was gorgeous and beautiful. Absolutely terrible weather, another would say. Horrifying, in fact. What the hell is happening with the weather? I remember the oldest of us, a woman who had lived through the Great Depression and was normally tough as nails, then cried openly and sobbed. Why is the weather doing this? Rush stood through all of this, visibly hopeful and terrified. The old woman screamed at him, "Why don't you just go inside?" He could only shrug and shakingly tell her, "I don't want to go inside. I like sunburns on my feet." She approached with both hands up to throttle him, but changed her mind as she came within reach. "You're a man, you can take it. I shouldn't interrupt your enjoyment of nature." She hobbled away in tears, trembling violently. Another of our neighbors stepped forward. "At least take these clothes," he handed, and held a folded shirt and pair of jeans forward, but turned away before getting close enough to hand them over. You probably don't want my old hand-me-downs." "Right," Russ replied hopelessly. "I'm fine, thanks though." It was the rainy season in our parts, and it began to drizzle on our heads, so we retreated into our homes to gaze out the window and watch Russ thirstily hold open his mouth to the sky. Once the torrent of it was heavy enough, he could also lean down and scoop up the water to flow running along the curb. That gave us an idea. As a neighborhood, we began to wash our cars more often. The runoff from the house would flow past Russ, allowing him to drink and stay alive, but only for as long as one was to normally wash one's car. None of us mentioned it to one another. We just saw others doing it, so we did it too. The rainy season also brought worms up out of the ground, which he ate, and he learned to stand still long enough for birds to come near. He would grab them and eat them whole. The sidewalk near him became foul with waste until each rain washed it clean. One of the men on the street began building a long wood and metal contraption. For the first time in a month, we had something else to see outside of our windows, and we would watch him for nearly a week before getting a sense of what he was doing. It was a massively long Rube Goldberg machine full of levers, swinging hammers, rolling balls, and other assorted nonsense. From the 2x4s he laid out, he planned for it to extend all the way down the street and around the corner out of sight. My roommate and I took a few days off work and wordlessly began to help. The older woman in the neighborhood brought out drinks and food for us. Russ looked on while we ate and drank, but watched especially carefully while we worked. I'd never been one for tools, but I muddled through, figuring out how to saw and nail things effectively. And the other men in the neighborhood joined us without a word. They saw how serious we were. It took 6 days, but finally finished the contraption on the eve of a big storm. As the sky was growing dark, we gathered around the corner out of sight of Russ and started at the bottom that would activate the machine. If all the levers and hammers and the contraptions worked, Russ would be knocked over by a battering ram mechanism at the very end. We stared at the button. A jogger approached, and we stared at her. She slowed and looked worried at the 30-odd people that were watching her. We backed up and glanced at the button repeatedly. "You want me to push this?" she asked, cautiously but concerned. "Is this for some sort of prank video?" We looked at each other, and the old woman who had survived the Great Depression shrugged and nodded. The jogger moved close and hovered her hand over the button before backing up. "Nah, I'd rather not participate in a prank video." Her expression was fearful and pained. She jogged on as we stood in despair. The storm came and destroyed most of the mechanisms. The man who'd started it took down in grief-stricken silence over the course of the next week. Russ watched the process with despondent eyes. A moving truck pulled up one morning, and we gathered on the street to watch his wife begin packing things. Russ lost his job just because he stopped showing up, she explained. "And now we can't afford this place anymore." She looked over at him with narrowed eyes and said hatefully, "I don't understand why he's doing this, but I'm not staying with an unemployed loser who would rather stand around all day than do some honest work." "This is honest work," he called over, crying despite his words. "It's tough standing here without rest. I too get tired, but someone has to do it." We watched her put Russ's son in the passenger seat and then drive off with most of its contents of the house. We looked to Russ. He gulped, wiped his tears away, and gave the filmiest reasoning I'd ever heard. "It's more important that I stand here than I go after my family. I didn't value them anyway." He seemed to give up after that, letting the sun sear his flesh day after day and not even bothering to eat worms that followed each storm. That was July. The first party on our street had seen in months nearly sparked a riot. Our place was one of 2 on the street designated as off-campus housing, and the other house kicked off a kegger at about 7 o'clock one night. Outrage and anger flowed with us into the foyer of that house. The college guys therein turned down the music and had their friends hang back a second as the entire neighborhood crowded in. The old woman asked, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Having a party," one of the guys responded. "What's the problem? We're not being loud." I was actually the one who spoke next. I remember my righteous anger vividly. How can you have a party while things are the way they are? One of the other guys who lived there protested. "So what? We're just supposed to stop everything and not live our lives because of the way things are?" The guests looked at us in confusion. The most painful part about that argument was that the other guys were right. We couldn't just stop our lives because of what was happening on our street. The shouts and yells from each side were more about how we felt than any logical debate, and a fistfight broke out just long enough to knock over the cake and break 2 glasses. We held each other back and retreated as a neighborhood, leaving the college guys to their party. I was bitter, so bitter, and we all felt that bitterness together. Until another neighborhood had a party 2 nights later. A week after that, one of my roommates had our friends over for a board game night, and I had to admit that it felt like such a relief to return to normalcy. At the end of the night, I walked the last of our friends out, had one last joke and laugh, and then waved after them. Russ was just a silhouette in the darkness, always there, but no longer on our minds all the time. Of course, the next morning, the guilt hit me like a load of bricks as I stood over my coffee maker and studied the boil-covered red scarecrow across the street. His blue robes were growing tattered after months outside, and he looked like a burned corpse. Unfortunately, I had a stressful day ahead, and I couldn't afford to process my guilt at that moment. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was the one who did it. I closed the blinds over the kitchen window. It was supposed to have been just for that day, just so I could get through the big project at hand, but the blinds never came back up after that. As a house, as a group, we stopped looking out the window. Just like washing our cars, just like working on the Rube Goldberg machine, and just like that, our reaction to the party, my neighbors took that as a cue. Within 5 days, all the blinds on all the windows of the entire street were lowered. That first night that Russ was completely alone outside in the dark, with all the blinds closed, an absolute guarantee that nobody was looking out for him or at him. I laid in my bed staring at the ceiling and crying quietly. This was not like the other pains on the street, not like the ones that couldn't be articulated. I knew exactly what I'd done this time, and I could think and say the words since it was my issue and my guilt alone. I was the first one to close the blinds. I wanted to be the first one to raise them again, to look out upon our neighborhood problem and force everyone else to open their eyes and unite again. But I didn't have the courage. I needed to work. I needed to pay rent. I couldn't be the one because raising my blinds would mean acknowledging the problem, and I couldn't afford to be racked by guilt and confusion and pain any longer. Each night I prayed that somebody else would be in the first to raise their blinds. Surely someone would do it. It was the only conscientious path, and someone would definitely feel compelled to do the right thing. Then we could all do it together. I'd put the issue out of my thoughts for so long that I was actually startled when I saw Russ healthier than before. With nobody mowing his lawn or trimming his trees, and with an abnormally rainy season, the greenery around him had grown to shade him nearly the entire day. His skin was back to a decent color where crinkled parchment had peeled off, and a large number of crickets and other bugs had taken up residence in his waist-high lawn. On these he fed, reaching down to grab insects at random and eat them when the urge struck him. I looked because a car had pulled up. I began to watch a real estate lady get out and began to pester him. "Hey!" I shouted from across the way, defensive over our issue. "You leave Russ alone." "This is ridiculous," she called back. "I need to sell this property. I'm never going to get a buyer interested in a property with a withered homeless man standing outside of it." "He's not homeless," I shouted at her. This is his home. Not anymore. His wife got it in the divorce because he failed to show up to the hearings. I don't know why I said it. I meant the sidewalk. Somehow, at some point, I'd accepted it as simply the way things were. The real estate lady glared at me and then at Russ. And then she got in her car and left. I knew what would happen next. And my roommates and I harassed the landscaping crew she sent until they got fed up and left too. If they mowed the lawn and pruned the trees, Russ would be in serious trouble. We congratulated ourselves for a job well done and then went back into the house for a board game night. That was in August. The derisive talk began earlier this month, as the first chill of autumn hit the air. I think people instinctively knew that the worst was yet to come for him. Whenever we happened to glance his way, someone would spit and call him an idiot for standing out there like that. Why doesn't he just go inside, someone would ask. Yeah, what a dumbass, someone else would say. I just stared at them when they said things like that. I did wish it would stop, that he would stop, but I don't know. I just don't know. I was prompted to write this and share our situation because I saw it in myself. I saw my feelings turning toward blame and hatred. I asked the same questions. Why was he doing this? Why wouldn't he just go inside? But that strange dread notion that I could not articulate drove me to go outside and do something no one else had done in weeks. Talk to him. Hey, Russ, I said by way of opening, since I had no idea what else to say. His hair was a mane and his beard was wild, but there was still a man under there. He coughed to clear his throat and he managed to say, hey. There really was no beating around the bush. You gave up for her a little while there, didn't you? He nodded weakly. What changed your mind? Why are you eating and drinking again? Why do you fight so hard to survive? I asked him, my heart full of compassion. I felt like I was such a great person for caring when nobody else did. I will never forget his bemused, angry laugh. He tiddled his head and said, to stick it to you assholes. That was the answer I'd never expected. We'd done so much for him, gone through so much guilt and angst and effort. But I guess I'd never thought about what it was like on the other side of the blinds. Standing there night after night, knowing the entire neighborhood was avoiding looking at you. I don't have an answer. I don't have any answers. I wanted to tell him good luck, but it would have just sounded hollow. I nodded and went inside this time. I raised the blinds and stood by the kitchen window as the first flakes of snow for the season began to fall. I accepted his angry gaze. Would the heat of his hate be enough to keep him warm through the winter? Summer seems impossibly far away, especially without so much as a blanket. And yet, all the people who come over, all my friends, my roommates, and acquaintances all just keep asking idly, why doesn't he just go inside? If only things were that simple. You know what's funny? I still can't tell you what's wrong. I'm haunted. There's been a man standing on the sidewalk opposite our house, staring right at us for a year and a half. And I can't physically think or speak the words that might describe what's wrong with it. I'm screaming soundlessly at the edges of my thoughts. But I'm also drinking coffee in the kitchen sink, to wake up for my day. One of my roommates zombie shuffles by in his pajamas and opens the fridge and stares at the food inside. He makes no motion for a long moment, an action which any outside observer would attribute to the lack of bacon in the bottom right drawer. But he and I both know what his heavy pause is really about. I'm looking out the window and he's looking at the empty fridge, but a question is passing between us. I answer in affirmative by doing nothing. Yes, he is still there. If the man staring back at me from the sidewalk opposite our house was not still there, I would say something. I would say anything meaningful at all. Getting colder out, I say casually, looking up at the sky. My roommate grunts. It's just a comment about the weather, and yet, as the most we can possibly bring ourselves to speak on the subject, it means everything. Last winter, the cold never came. It was the warmest on record for our area, and the man on the sidewalk did not die. Last winter, we were rooting for him to survive. Sometimes I wonder whether he truly did. Coffee's done, so I have to move on. It's uncomfortable, but I have to walk past his hate-filled gaze to my car because my roommates have the garage this month. Jacket on, laptop bag slung over my shoulder, no more delays. Inside my own front door, I take a deep breath. All right, here we go. I only have to cut across our lawn, but the restrained dash fills me with tension every single morning as the bitter air strikes my face. I look anywhere except the man across the street. The street is silent, empty. No cars park here. No children play here. And the lawns are wild. The neighbors seized upon any and every excuse to move away, and pretty soon we became the only populated house left. You think our rent would go down, but of course not. The worst part of the 15-second walk to my car is that it brings me closer to him. I can feel the heat of his hatred on my skin, and it flares as I grow nearer. Pretending to be at ease, I look at the ground and at my car door and slip in with a sigh of relief. Except I'm not relieved. I am ever so slightly crying out of ostensibly an adult. But I am sitting in my car and staring forward with the misty eyes for no reason that I can put words into. The heat comes right through the window. Shutting the door didn't help. Sometimes the pressure inside my chest reaches a point where it feels like it's on the edge of bursting. I'm about to scream it. I'm about to say the words, but I can't stand, and my skin prickles painfully as the fire instead backdrafts through my arteries. As I force myself to turn on the car and drive away, I struggle with it again during my daily commute. He's just a man. His name is Russ. He's absurd, really. He's wearing a tattered blue bathrobe that has been shredded by the elements over the past year and a half. His hair is wild and his skin is sun-torched toward leather, living on worms, birds that stray too close, and the insects that call his body home. He's basically a crazy homeless man. Except he's not homeless. Beyond the 6-foot-tall grass that's his house behind him. Still, technically, because nobody will buy it. That's the one horrific question that everyone else usually asks just before they stop caring and leave. Why doesn't he just go inside? But I refuse to ask that question. If it were that simple, don't you think we'd... Stopped at a red light. I gesture forward in frustration with both hands, trying to grasp the rest to make a point to nobody. But the words refuse to form together. They slip past one another, slamming into the sides of my brain instead of linking together to make an idea. To my right, a frazzled and dirty woman stands on the corner. I look her way and she looks back at me, somewhat surprised that I am acknowledging her. Is she like Russ also? No, she takes a few steps forward, about to ask for money, and I jump the gun a little bit on the red light to avoid the awkward situation I've caused. The funny thing is, I see it coming, but more afraid of one danger than the other, and I misjudge the gap. A blue truck slams into the passenger side of my car. I walk the rest of the way to work, blinking, looking at my hands virtually the entire time. Something was different, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I kept touching the upper left corner of my forehead, too, but the phantom warmth there never turned out to be blood. I wasn't injured, as far as I could tell. Nobody noticed anything wrong either. As I entered my office 20 minutes late and sat at my computer, nobody noticed my absence, really. Before this situation with Russ, I had spent every morning in terror of being late, but that just seemed small and absurd now. The overhead lights flickered, and I briefly glanced up. "Hey, man," the coworker at my right said, swiveling my way and leaning in with conspiratorial eyes. "Did you hear about the building across the street burned down last night?" Momentarily surprised, I swiveled my own chair to glance out the window behind us, but there was nothing to see. Perhaps he meant a different building. I swung back to ask him to clarify, but he was already leaning toward the guy to his right to spread the word, and it didn't really matter anyway. I got up to get a cup of coffee from the break room, and the nice secretary lady and a few cubicles down from mine asked as I passed, "Saw you walk up to the building. Everything all right?" "Car accident," I said with a grimace, making sure to keep moving so she didn't ask any further details. She didn't try. In the break room, that one older guy from sales stood up, a foot from the wall, just facing it. Reflexively, I said, but he didn't acknowledge me. Okay, maybe he was thinking about something. Sliding past, I poured some coffee into a mug and headed out the door. Except, at the exit, where I once would have bolted to avoid someone acting strangely, I turned and watched him instead. Was he like Russ? This haunting wasn't going to end on its own. I understood that now. Maybe this older guy from sales was just tuned out. Maybe he was listening to something. Focusing on my ears, I could suddenly hear the droning, constant sigh of the building's air conditioning. It had always been there, but I'd blocked it out for exactly that reason. If you'd asked me before that moment, I would not have been able to tell you if there was air conditioning was audible in my building. It sort of clanked by way of turning off. Wow, it was actually rather loud now that I was aware of it, making me wonder how I'd never noticed it before. And the guy from sales turned and walked away without even acknowledging me. Okay. I looked to my right and I saw that a guy in a cubicle several rows down had stopped his work to watch me and wonder what I was doing. He turned away in a hurry and I finally stopped standing in the break room door. Something was wrong. As I sat at my computer that morning, I could finally face that first, vaguest level of fact that something was wrong. The barest acknowledgement had been eluding me for the last year and a half, and my heart began to race as I repeated that realization to myself over and over. It was like a birthday, a promotion, and Christmas all in one. Something was wrong. Elated and terrified energy coursed under my ribcage as my haunting finally took a step forward. No matter how slight a step it might have actually been, the feeling had always been there, agonizing and terrifying everyone in my neighborhood. But now I could finally consciously think to myself that something was wrong. But what? Swiveling this way and that, ever so casually, I peered around my office. I saw my boss 2 aisles over, and I got up to go talk to him about my car. He glanced my way. He definitely saw me, but he quickly acted as if someone had called him over from a perpendicular direction around the corner. He hurried away. His body language made it clear that the nice secretary lady had told him about my accident, and he didn't want to endure the awkwardness of having to reject my request for an advance on my paycheck to get my car fixed. The air conditioner clunked loudly off, and it occurred to me that I hadn't noticed it coming back on. Something was wrong. That older guy from sales had just been staring at the wall. But all of these people were just staring at their desktops. Because of the principle of mutually assured destruction, I had always avoided looking at their monitors, so they would never look at mine. But now I dared the boundary of rude by peeking over half a dozen shoulders. Facebook, Reddit, Minesweeper, Facebook, a blank Word document. I touched the warmth at the upper left corner of my forehead, but there was nothing there. Agitated by something that I couldn't be expressed in words, I began to wander toward the front door. On the way, I heard someone to my right say to a coworker, "Hey, did you hear the building across the street burned down last night?" The coworker's response, "Wow, that's crazy. Was anyone hurt?" I narrowed my eyes and picked up the pace, pushing right through the front doors into the open winter air without a jacket. To the left, normal. To the right, normal. Passing the sleek red Lamborghini my boss always drove, I took a walk around the office. And then I crossed the street and circled the block under a gray sky. I found no trace of the supposed burned-down building. People had definitely been telling each other of a building that had burned down, so where was it? It seemed ridiculous that people would be telling each other that without anyone ever actually checking outside to see if it was true. On the way home, walking without a jacket and yet oddly warm, I listened to the conversations of other pedestrians instead of politely ignoring them like usual. At a corner, while waiting to cross, one woman said to the other, "Did you know there's a second moon we've never seen?" And her friend replied, "What, seriously? Where?" "It's been on the other side the whole time. If you were in New Zealand, well, that's the moon they see. And they've never seen our moon." That's incredible. To this, I accidentally said out loud, "What the fuck is happening?" Both women glared at me, held themselves a little closer, and hurried away. It then occurred to me that the three of us had been waiting for a crossing signal at the intersection with no traffic. I decided to throw caution to the wind and cross the road without waiting. But I still felt a little weird about it. There were no cars. I made it safely, but there were no cars. As I carried on, the women continued to glance warily at me from a distance while they waited dutifully for the next crossing signal. I couldn't help but wonder if something was wrong with my head. If there was something wrong with my thoughts, then maybe, just maybe, I could finally do something about my haunting. As much as it dominated that particular spot on the sidewalk, the specter in my neighborhood also had a home in the impossibility of words to convey its nature. If my words weren't working right, then perhaps new avenues were open. I probably needed to go to the hospital for a concussion or something, but before I did that, I had to reach Russ. Uber! Yes, I was a genius. Using my phone, I summoned an Uber. No sense in walking in the cold, right? In 3 minutes flat, I was hopping back into the seat of an unfamiliar car driven by a stranger who had surely been vetted by somebody somewhere. On any other day, I would have hoped for silence, but today I welcomed it when the driver began talking. Something about this was crucial for my coming interaction with Russ. You a local? He asked. Nope, I lied for some reason. Going with it after a brief pause because I couldn't see myself talking my way out of it, I continued. Just landed. I'm from New Zealand. Oh, that's cool, man. How do you like our moon compared to yours? I just sat there and stared at the back of his head for a moment. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror and finally I said, yours is bigger, I guess? That's what they say. He touched the radio, rolling it louder. You mind? I shook my head, then tapped the warmth above my left eye, still finding no blood. The radio began radiating complete nonsense. There were words there, yes, but they formed either no coherent ideas or ideas that were the opposite of basic reality. I watched as the taxi driver nodded along with the amounted to the ravings of a madman. I finally remembered. The left frontal cortex behind the left eye. That's where language is processed. Had I somehow damaged my bronchus area? I knew all about it because of an old episode of a science fiction show that dealt with a virus that damaged that area. Was that right? No, wait. If that was damaged, I shouldn't have been able to understand language, but not speak it. Instead, I seemed to be afflicted the other way around. The driver pulled up to the end of my street. Sorry, man, this is as far as I go. I understood. Nobody ever went down our street anymore. I hadn't even brought my laptop back. It felt weird to walk down my street without a jacket or laptop bag. It hadn't been weird before, but now, Russ was staring at me from the other end of the block. And he was probably wondering what I was doing home so early and without my things. Stopping firmly on the pavement about 5 feet away from him, I finally looked at him in the eyes for the first time in a year. He was still there, underneath all the wild hair, ragged blue tatters and burnt skin. His eyes still held essence. He had, in fact, survived last winter. I glanced down. His toes were black. He coughed gruffly and then said, "What do you want, asshole?" His hatred for us had kept him going all this time. I'd always known that. I'd always known that if we too had moved away, he would have been left here completely alone. And then he truly would have died. The neighborhood, as it existed back then, had tried so many things, and nothing had worked, but now I could actually admit that there was something wrong. Russ, why don't you come over to our house for a bit? I don't want to, he lied, pained all the more for his inability to talk about it. I tried again. Want to go for a walk? Too cold. I'd rather stay here. He lied again, his expression agonized. I moved forward, intent on pushing him from his spot, but about 2 feet away, I changed my mind. After all, he'd been there so long, it probably would damage him somehow to move him. Stepping back to 5 feet away, I clenched my fists. Nothing had changed. He glared even more intensely at me. Stop it. I moved forward, intent on pulling him from his spot, but about 2 feet away, I changed my mind. What would our neighbors be without him standing there? Without him there, everything would change, and who knew how long things would look? All sorts of horrible people might move into these empty houses. Stepping back 5 feet away, I grimaced and turned back around to face him. He was furious now. What the hell is wrong with you? Stop. I still felt oddly warm. I was full of pressure. I wanted to explode, to scream, to lay down in a ball and cry. Everything was off. The world was insane, and I could put this goddamn problem into words. So I offered the only true step I'd made. For the first time, somebody asked him, "Russ, is something wrong?" He stared at me, but not with hate that had colored him for our last year. "What? How did you?" His mouth opened wider for a moment, but no sound followed. He then said, "Ask me again." I was so glad to ask again. "Russ, is something wrong?" His jaw shuddered as he struggled. I nodded and made an encouraging motion with my hands. He made the first syllable and then caught on triumphantly to a successful tactic. Letting that syllable go, he made a separate one. He deflated like a balloon after reaching those 2 syllables, as if the effort had cost him all of his willpower. For a moment, barely audible, he shook, laughing and crying with alternating intensity. I tried to approach, but I changed my mind about 2 feet away again. No, it wasn't. It was only about 1.5 feet away this time. You know what's funny? I still can't tell you what's wrong. I am haunted. There's been a man standing on the sidewalk opposite our house staring right at us for a full 1.5 years, and I can't physically think or speak the words that might describe what's wrong with that. I'm also drinking coffee at the kitchen sink to wake up for my day. One of my roommates, Zombie, shuffles by in his pajamas, opens the fridge and stares at the food inside. He makes no motion for a long moment, an action which any outside observer would attribute to the lack of sausage in the bottom left drawer. But he and I both know what his heavy pause is really about. I'm looking out the window and he's looking at the empty fridge, but a question is passing between us. To answer that question, I wave. From across the street, Russ waves back. I look over at my roommate and he frowns angrily at me in return, because I know the earth only has 1 moon. But he goes about his business for lack of an ability to sway me otherwise. There is only 1 moon in the sky, and I'm going to save Russ someday, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop me.